Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Urbanist Lens. You know what? Another week, another fascinating topic to discourse on. It's like we're urban philosophers or something. How's it going? You surviving the concrete jungle out there?
I live for these discourses, even if sometimes I feel like I'm navigating an obstacle course just to grab a coffee. Speaking of which, did you hear they're finally opening that new park downtown? I'm dying to check it out.
Wait, seriously? That's awesome. We've been talking about that forever. Maybe this whole 15-minute city thing is actually catching on. Who knows? Which, speaking of, is exactly what we're diving into today. Get this. The 15-minute city. It's an urban planning concept all about making cities more livable and less car-dependent.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So more than just a catchy name, what's the deal with this 15-minute magic?
All right, so picture this. You ready? Everything you need, work, school, groceries, healthcare, even that park you mentioned, all within a 15-minute radius of your home. And you can get there by walking, biking, or a quick hop on public transit. No more battling traffic for an hour just to get a loaf of bread.
That sounds like a dream, especially in a city like New York. But hold on, haven't we heard this tune before? Doesn't this tie back to those ideas from Jane Jacobs and that whole new urbanism movement?
You are SO on point. It's not like this idea appeared out of thin air. Jane Jacobs, way back in the day, was all about walkable mixed-use neighborhoods. She believed that cities should be designed for people, not cars, and that vibrant street life was key to a thriving community. Sound familiar? The 15-minute city takes that idea and kind of modernizes it.
So it's like taking those classic urban design principles and giving them a 21st century spin. I like it. But wouldn't that be tough to implement in a city that's well already built?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And it's something we'll definitely unpack as we go deeper into this. I was reading about this study on mobility patterns in some major U.S. cities, and it showed that even small shifts towards 15-minute city principles could lead to a pretty dramatic decrease in CO2 emissions.
See, that's what I find fascinating. It's not just some feel-good idea. It's got real potential to tackle some of the big issues we face, like climate change. But isn't it more than just the environmental aspect? I feel like this concept taps into something deeper, that human need for connection.
Totally. And there's research to back that up. Studies show that when people have easy access to their daily needs and can walk or bike around their neighborhood, they tend to be healthier both physically and mentally. Plus, think about the community aspect. You're more likely to run into your neighbor's chat on the street, maybe even discover a new hidden gem in your own backyard.
It's that sense of serendipity, right? Like stumbling upon a cool little cafe or bookstore you never knew existed because you decided to walk instead of drive. Speaking of discoveries, tell me about this amazing little Italian bakery you were raving about the other day. Cannolis, you said.
Oh man, those cannolis are life-changing. And you know what? That bakery is just a 5-minute walk from my apartment. It's those little moments, that really highlight the beauty of having everything close by. But I guess the big question is, can this concept actually work on a larger scale?
Well, some cities are already giving it a go, and with pretty impressive results. Paris, for example, has really embraced the 15-minute city idea under Mayor Hidalgo. They've been creating these super blocks, which are basically mini neighborhoods within the city where car traffic is limited, and they're prioritizing pedestrians, cyclists, and green spaces.
Wait, super blocks. What exactly are those, and how do they actually work?
So imagine a typical city block, right? Now picture several of those blocks grouped together, and within that zone, car traffic is restricted to the perimeter. So you basically have this inner area that's a haven for pedestrians and cyclists. They've been implementing this in Barcelona too, and the results are pretty remarkable.
I'm trying to picture this in a New York City context. It's almost like a mini Central Park, but spread throughout the city. I mean, it sounds amazing in theory, but how do you handle things like deliveries, emergency services, or people who still need to drive?
Those are all valid concerns, and that's where the planning gets really intricate. It's about finding creative solutions like designated delivery zones, underground parking for residents, and efficient public transit connections. It's not about banning cars altogether. It's about prioritizing other modes of transportation and making them more appealing.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that lead to some serious pushback from people who are used to driving everywhere? And what about the potential impact on businesses that rely on car traffic?
You're hitting on one of the biggest challenges, and it's something that cities need to address head on. One of the main criticisms you hear is that the 15-minute city is elitist, or that it could lead to gentrification and displacement of lower-income residents. And that's a legitimate concern.
Yeah, I mean, look at what happened in some neighborhoods in Brooklyn when they started adding bike lanes and fancy coffee shops. Rents skyrocketed, and a lot of longtime residents were forced out. It's a tough balance, trying to improve the city without displacing the people who make it what it is.
Absolutely. And that's why it's crucial for cities to incorporate affordable housing policies and community engagement into any 15-minute city plan. It can't just be about creating these idyllic little bubbles for the wealthy. It has to benefit everyone.
Okay, so we've got these amazing potential benefits, but also some serious challenges to consider. I'm curious, are there any other cities besides Paris and Barcelona that are trying to make this 15-minute city thing a reality?
You bet. It's actually gaining traction all over the world. Portland, Oregon, for example, has been focusing on something called complete neighborhood strategies,
Uh-huh.
which is basically their version of the 15-minute city. And even here in the U.S., some cities are starting to experiment with different aspects of the model.
Hold on. Complete neighborhood strategies.
Yeah.
What exactly does that entail? Break that down for me, for our listeners, of course.
Right. So a complete neighborhood in the context of Portland is basically one where residents have easy access to a full range of amenities and services within a 20-minute walk or bike ride. Think grocery stores, parks, schools, healthcare, even job centers.
Yeah.
And they're not just focusing on the physical infrastructure, they're also looking at things like social connectivity and economic opportunity within these neighborhoods.
That makes sense. So it's like a more holistic approach to creating livable communities. But what are some specific examples of how they're actually implementing this in Portland? Give us the nitty-gritty details.
They're doing things like building more mixed-use developments where you have residential, commercial, and even light industrial spaces all in one area. They're also investing heavily in public transportation, bike infrastructure, and pedestrian-friendly streetscapes. And they're working closely with community groups to ensure that these changes are equitable and benefit everyone.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So from Paris to Portland, it seems like this 15-minute city idea is really starting to take root. But before we get too carried away, let's not forget about those challenges we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
I mean, is it really feasible to transform entire cities based on this concept?
It's definitely a tall order, especially in cities that are already heavily built up and car-dependent. But the fact that cities around the world are experimenting with these ideas shows that there's a real appetite for change. I think the key is to start small, to focus on pilot projects and incremental changes that can demonstrate the benefits and build momentum.
That's a good point. You don't have to boil the ocean all at once, right?
Hmm.
Start with those bite-sized chunks, prove the concept, and then scale it up. But I'm still wondering, what would a 15-minute city actually look like in a place like New York City? I mean, we're talking about a city of millions of people crammed into a relatively small space.
Exactly. It's a unique challenge, but also a unique opportunity. New York already has a lot of the elements that make a 15-minute city possible, like a dense population, a robust public transportation system, and a vibrant mix of uses in many neighborhoods. But there are also some major hurdles like high rents, traffic congestion, and a lot of zoning regulations that don't exactly encourage mixed-use development.
Yeah, those zoning regulations are a beast. It's like they were designed to keep everything separated, residential over here, commercial over there, industrial way over there. How do you even begin to unravel that and create those integrated, walkable neighborhoods we've been talking about?
It's not going to be easy, that's for sure. It would require some serious political will and a major overhaul of the city's zoning code. But I think it's a conversation worth having. What if we could reimagine those vast industrial zones along the waterfront or those sprawling parking lots in Midtown? What if we could transform them into vibrant mixed-use communities where people could live, work, and play all within a 15-minute radius?
Okay, now you're talking. That's the kind of bold vision we need.
Yeah.
But let's be real. How do you convince developers and policymakers to embrace this kind of radical shift?
It's about making the case for the economic, social, and environmental benefits, and it's about demonstrating that this is not just some fringe idea, but a viable model that's already working in other cities around the world.
You know, it's funny, all this talk about 15-minute cities reminds me of that time I was in
Paris.
No, this was actually in my old neighborhood here in Queens. I was making dinner and realized I was out of garlic. Disaster, right? But instead of hopping in the car and driving to the supermarket, I just strolled down the block to a little bodega on the corner, grabbed my garlic, and was back home in 5 minutes. It was such a simple thing, but it really made me appreciate the value of having everything you need within easy reach.
Those small moments can really shift your perspective. It's like you suddenly realize that life doesn't have to be this constant battle against distance and traffic. And that's what I find so appealing about the 15-minute city concept. It's about reclaiming our time, our health, and our connection to our communities.
It's like hitting the reset button on how we live in cities, right? Instead of being slaves to our cars, we can actually enjoy this simple act of walking, biking, and interacting with our surroundings.
And it's not just about individual well-being. Think about the impact on our planet if we could significantly reduce car dependency. Less air pollution, less noise pollution, fewer greenhouse gas emissions. It's a win-win for everyone.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the historical roots of this concept to its potential benefits and challenges. But I think we need to take a step back and really unpack some of the key terms we've been throwing around. What exactly do we mean by walkable, mixed use, and all these other buzzwords that are floating around?
You're right. Sometimes we get so caught up in the big picture that we forget to define the building blocks. So let's break it down.
Let's do it. But first, a word from our sponsors. Just kidding. We're a nonprofit podcast. Remember, no sponsors here.
Huh. Okay, so when we talk about walkable, we're talking about more than just the ability to physically walk from point A to point B. It's about creating an environment where walking is safe, enjoyable, and convenient. Think wide sidewalks, well-maintained crosswalks, shade trees, benches, and interesting things to see along the way.
So it's about the whole experience, not just the mechanics of putting one foot in front of the other.
Mm.
But what about mixed use? That one always throws me off.
Mixed use is all about integrating different types of land uses within a neighborhood. So instead of having strictly residential areas, commercial districts, and industrial zones, you have a more organic blend of everything. You might have apartments above shops, offices next to parks, and even light industrial spaces incorporated into residential areas.
So it's about breaking down those traditional silos and creating a more dynamic, interconnected urban fabric. I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together, but I'm still a little fuzzy on the whole superblock concept.
Yeah.
Can you give us a little more detail on how that actually works?
Sure. So as I mentioned earlier, a superblock is basically a group of city blocks where through traffic is limited to the perimeter roads. This creates a calmer, more pedestrian-friendly environment within the superblock.
So it's like creating a mini neighborhood within the larger city grid? But how do you actually achieve that? Do you just put up roadblocks and tell people they can't drive through?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. It involves redesigning streets, adding pedestrian plazas, and creating traffic calming measures to discourage cut-through traffic. The idea is not to ban cars altogether, but to make it less appealing to drive through these areas.
I see it's about shifting the balance in favor of pedestrians, cyclists, and public transit. And I imagine this would have a ripple effect on the whole neighborhood, encouraging people to walk or bike more and creating a more vibrant street life.
Exactly. And when you have more people out and about, you tend to have safer streets, more social interaction, and a stronger sense of community.
It's like creating a virtuous cycle of urban livability. But I'm curious, what are some of the challenges of implementing superblocks, especially in a dense, chaotic city like New York?
One of the biggest challenges is dealing with existing traffic patterns. You have to carefully analyze how closing off certain streets will affect traffic flow in the surrounding area and make sure you're not creating gridlock. You also have to address concerns about access for emergency vehicles, deliveries, and people with disabilities.
Right, accessibility is crucial. You can't just prioritize one group over another. It has to work for everyone. But I'm also thinking about the logistics of actually redesigning these streets. I mean, New York City streets are notoriously narrow and crowded. How do you even find the space to create pedestrian plazas and bike lanes without making things even more congested?
That's where creativity and compromise come in. It might involve narrowing sidewalks in some areas to widen the street for bike lanes or converting on-street parking spaces into pedestrian areas. And it might require some tough decisions about prioritizing different modes of transportation.
It sounds like a complex puzzle with a lot of moving pieces. But I think the potential benefits are worth exploring. And who knows, maybe one day we'll be strolling through car-free superblocks all over New York City. A guy can dream, right?
Dream big. That's how change happens. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we start envisioning a utopian future of car-free superblocks, let's take a closer look at what's actually happening on the ground right now. Are there any specific examples of superblocks or similar initiatives that are working well in other cities?
That's a great question. And it leads us perfectly into our next segment, where we'll be exploring some real-world examples of how the 15-minute city and related concepts are being implemented around the globe. Stay tuned.
All right, so we've laid the groundwork, explored the concepts behind the 15-minute city, and even touched on some potential challenges. Now let's take a trip around the world, shall we? And see how these ideas are actually playing out in different urban contexts.
I love a good urban adventure. Passport's ready. Where are we headed first?
Well, we can't talk about the 15-minute city without paying homage to the city that's become synonymous with the movement. Paris, remember those superblocks we were discussing? Paris has been at the forefront of implementing them.
Right, Paris, the city of lights, love, and now apparently superblocks. Tell me more about what they're doing there. How exactly are they transforming their neighborhoods?
Under Mayor Anne Hidalgo, they've been quite strategic. They've pedestrianized large sections along the Seine, making them car-free havens for strolling, cycling, and just enjoying the urban ambiance. And it's not just about aesthetics. They're also converting schoolyards into community spaces after hours, creating more green areas, and encouraging a shift towards active modes of transportation.
So it's a multi-pronged approach, tackling infrastructure, community spaces,
Yeah.
and even transportation habits. Pretty impressive. But is it actually working? I mean, are Parisians embracing this new way of life?
Well, there's always going to be some pushback with any major change, right? But for the most part, it seems to be having a positive impact. People are rediscovering the joy of walking and biking, and there's a renewed sense of community in these reimagined spaces.
That's encouraging to hear. But Paris is Paris. It's already a pretty walkable city with a great public transportation system. What about cities that are more, shall we say, car-centric? Can this concept work in places that are basically designed around the automobile?
That's a valid point, and it's where things get really interesting. Let's hop over to the other side of the Atlantic and take a look at Portland, Oregon. They've been doing some fascinating things with their complete neighborhood strategies.
Ah, yes. Portland, the land of craft beer hipsters and now complete neighborhoods. Remind me again, what exactly does that entail, and how does it connect to the 15-minute city idea?
Essentially, Portland's vision aligns with the 15-minute city principle, making sure residents have access to all their essential needs within a 20-minute walk or bike ride. Think grocery stores, parks, schools, healthcare facilities, and even job centers, all conveniently located within their neighborhoods. They're really going for that holistic approach to community building.
Okay, so it's about more than just physical proximity. It's about creating self-sufficient neighborhoods where people can truly live, work, and play without having to constantly rely on their cars. But how are they actually achieving this? Give us some concrete examples.
They're investing heavily in things like mixed-use developments where you have residential, commercial, and even light industrial spaces all coexisting in one area. They're also building out a comprehensive network of bike lanes and pedestrian-friendly streetscapes, and they're focusing on improving public transportation connectivity.
It's like they're weaving together all these different elements to create a more interconnected and vibrant urban fabric. I'm starting to get a sense of how this could work in practice. But what about the economic side of things? I mean, can you really have thriving businesses and job centers in these smaller localized neighborhoods? Doesn't that go against the traditional model of centralized business districts?
That's a great question, and it's something that cities are still grappling with. But think about it this way. When people can walk or bike to their local shops and restaurants, it creates a more sustainable customer base for those businesses. And when you have a mix of residential and commercial spaces, it creates a more vibrant street life and a stronger sense of community, which can attract new businesses and residents.
So it's like creating a positive feedback loop where walkability and mixed-use development reinforce each other, leading to a more dynamic and economically resilient neighborhood. That makes a lot of sense. But I'm still wondering about the challenges, especially in a city like New York, which is notorious for its high rents, traffic congestion, and just general chaos. Can this concept really work in such a complex and demanding urban environment?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. New York is a unique beast with its own set of challenges and opportunities, but I think the key is to start small, to experiment with pilot projects in different neighborhoods, and to learn from both the successes and the failures.
Right. It's about taking that iterative approach, testing the waters, and adapting the concept to the specific context.
Mm.
So let's put on our urban planning hats for a minute and imagine what a 15-minute city could look like in New York. Where would you start? What are some of the key areas that would need to be addressed?
Well, one of the biggest challenges in New York is the sheer density of the city. It's hard to imagine creating truly self-sufficient neighborhoods when space is at such a premium. But there are definitely opportunities to improve walkability and mixed-use development in many areas. For example, we could look at rezoning some of those vast industrial zones along the waterfront or those sprawling parking lots in Midtown to create more mixed-use communities where people could live, work, and play all within a 15-minute radius.
Okay, now you're talking. That's the kind of bold vision we need. But let's be real. How do you convince developers and policymakers to embrace this kind of radical shift? I mean, New York City real estate is all about maximizing profits, right? How do you make the case for a more people-centric approach?
Yeah. It's about highlighting the long-term benefits, both economic and social. When you create more livable and sustainable neighborhoods, you attract residents and businesses, which boost property values and tax revenues. And when you reduce car dependency, you reduce traffic congestion, air pollution, and noise pollution, which improves public health and quality of life. It's a win-win for everyone, even if it requires some short-term adjustments and compromises.
So it's about shifting the mindset from short-term profits to long-term sustainability and well-being. That's a powerful message, and I think it resonates with a lot of New Yorkers who are tired of the constant hustle and grind. But I'm still curious about the practicalities. How do you actually implement these changes in a city that's so entrenched in its existing patterns?
It would require a multi-pronged approach involving changes to zoning regulations, transportation infrastructure, and public investment priorities. For example, we could encourage more mixed-use development by offering tax incentives to developers who build projects that integrate residential, commercial, and community spaces. We could invest in expanding and improving public transportation options, making it easier and more affordable for people to get around without cars. And we could prioritize pedestrian and bike infrastructure, making our streets safer and more inviting for active modes of transportation.
It sounds like a massive undertaking, but also an incredibly exciting opportunity to rethink how we design and inhabit our cities. And I think it's a conversation that we need to keep having both at the policy level and at the community level, because ultimately the success of the 15-minute city concept depends on the collective will and imagination of the people who live in these cities.
Absolutely. It's about empowering communities to shape their own neighborhoods and to demand a better quality of life. It's about reimagining what our cities can be and creating a future where people come first, not cars.
Beautifully said. And you know what? All this talk about walkable neighborhoods and vibrant street life makes me want to go explore my own neighborhood a little more. Maybe discover a hidden gem I've never noticed before. Or just enjoy a leisurely stroll without worrying about traffic and parking.
That's the spirit. And who knows, maybe you'll even bump into a neighbor and strike up a conversation. That's the beauty of a 15-minute city. It brings people together and fosters a sense of community that's often missing in our busy urban lives.
I love that idea. So as we wrap up our exploration of the 15-minute city, I want to leave our listeners with this thought. What if we all took a little more time to explore our own neighborhoods, to discover the hidden treasures and connect with the people around us? Maybe we'd start to see our cities in a whole new light.
That's a wonderful thought, and it perfectly captures the essence of the 15-minute city movement. It's about reclaiming our cities, our time, and our sense of community.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to take a quick break, but we'll be back in a jiffy to discuss some of the criticisms and challenges associated with the 15-minute city concept. Stay tuned. All right, so, we've been talking about all the amazing things about the 15-minute city, but what about the other side of the coin? What are folks saying who aren't so thrilled about this idea?
Yeah, that's a good point. No concept is perfect, and the 15-minute city definitely has its share of criticisms.
So let's hear it. What are some of the main concerns that people have raised?
Well, one of the big ones is the potential for gentrification. When you make a neighborhood more desirable, it often leads to rising rents and property values, which can displace lower-income residents.
Yeah, that's a real concern, especially here in New York. We've seen it happen in so many neighborhoods. It's like a tale of two cities sometimes.
Yeah.
So how do we prevent the 15-minute city from becoming just another perk for the wealthy?
That's where thoughtful planning and community engagement come in. You have to make sure that affordable housing is a central part of any 15-minute city initiative. And you have to involve the community in the decision-making process from the very beginning.
Right. It can't just be a top-down approach. You need to listen to the people who actually live in these neighborhoods and make sure their needs are being met. But what about the impact on businesses? Some people argue that this hyper-local model could actually hurt economic growth.
That's an interesting point. But I think it's important to remember that the 15-minute city isn't about shutting down big businesses or discouraging economic activity. It's about creating a more diverse and resilient economy where local businesses can thrive alongside larger corporations.
So it's not an either-or situation. It's about finding a balance.
Right, exactly. And when you have more people living, working, and shopping within their own neighborhoods, it can actually create more economic opportunities for everyone.
That makes sense. But what about those folks who still rely on cars, like delivery drivers or people who live in more rural areas? Would they be left out in the cold?
It's true that not everyone can or wants to give up their car. And the 15-minute city isn't about forcing people to abandon their vehicles. It's about creating choices and making alternative modes of transportation more attractive and accessible.
So it's about giving people options and letting them decide what works best for them.
Exactly. And even for those who still need to drive, the 15-minute city can make those car trips shorter, less stressful, and more efficient because everything is closer to home.
I see. So it's not about demonizing cars. It's about creating a more balanced and sustainable transportation system. But I have to admit, some people see this whole 15-minute city thing as a bit Big Brother-ish, like it's some kind of conspiracy to keep people confined to their own little neighborhoods. What do you say to that?
I understand those concerns. But I think it's important to remember that the 15-minute city is not about restricting freedom. It's about enhancing it. It's about giving people more time and flexibility to do the things they enjoy because they're not spending hours stuck in traffic.
So it's about reclaiming that time and using it for things that actually matter to us, like spending time with loved ones or pursuing our passions.
Exactly. And when you have everything you need within easy reach, it opens up a whole new world of possibilities.
I love that idea.
Yeah.
But let's be realistic here. Is it really feasible to transform entire cities based on this concept? Especially in a place like New York, which is already so built up and kind of set in its ways.
It's definitely a challenge, there's no doubt about that. But I think it's important to remember that cities are constantly evolving and adapting. And the fact that we're even having this conversation shows that there's a growing appetite for change.
So you're saying it's not impossible, just maybe a little bit complicated.
Exactly. And I think the key is to start small, to experiment with pilot projects in different neighborhoods and to learn from those experiences.
So take that iterative approach. See what works, what doesn't, and adjust accordingly.
Exactly. And as those small successes start to add up, it can create a ripple effect and inspire bigger changes.
So it's about planting those seeds and nurturing them until they grow into something truly transformative.
Beautifully said. And I think that's what this whole 15-minute city conversation is really about. It's about challenging our assumptions, reimagining what's possible, and creating cities that are truly designed for people.
And it's about recognizing that our cities are more than just concrete jungles. They can be places of connection, community, and well-being.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this discourse.
Yeah, but before we do, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. Think about your own neighborhood. How far do you have to travel for your daily needs? What could be improved? And what small steps can you take to make your community a little more livable, a little more connected, and a little more 15-minute city-ish?
That's a great challenge. And for those who want to learn more about the 15-minute city and how to get involved in their own communities, we'll have links to some fantastic resources in our show notes.
Be sure to check those out. And join us next time for another fascinating discourse on the urbanist's lens. Until then, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep dreaming big. Adios, amigos.